Oh, good grief. I am sorry about that. My mic, for some strange reason, got turned off in Streamlabs, so I had to fix that. So, I do apologize for the late start. That's better. I am Abe with MysticGenmara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho, and we're off to a really bumpy start tonight. Anyway, tonight I want to introduce you to, if I can get my page to open up here, I want to introduce you to a gentleman that is not technically occult or mystic in his nature, but it's someone that he's associated with the Christian form of mysticism. Distantly, it influenced him. And with what I'm wanting to do with this particular type of live stream, the Occult and Crochet, and I promise I'm going to get to some crocheting, I just need to adjust some parts of my life. It's a little chaotic right now. But what I want to do here is not just introduce you to famous occultists, mystics, and magicians, psychics, etc. through the history. I also want to kind of bring in the fact that even though in today's culture and throughout the centuries, the concept of Christianity, Judaism, etc., the mainstream religions, have always been perceived as being at war with their less organized counterparts. They actually have a lot more in common than we realize, just because of, so there's some crossover that occurs. Like last week or 2 weeks ago, if you haven't seen it, go check that out. I talked about Emanuel Swedenborg, who is an actual Christian mystic. And this particular person I'm talking about today was influenced partly, and actually the person I'm going to talk about today did a lot of work annotating, commenting on, kind of filling in the blanks on Swedenborg's original work. Now, don't get me wrong, Swedenborg's original work stands on its own, but this gentleman tonight helped support some of that. And who I'm speaking of is John Wesley. If you have never heard of him, this could be this is a little bit longer, I will say that, but this could be an interesting journey for you. Let's hop in the Wayback Machine, because we're going back to the era that has a lot of interesting people in it from the spiritual community and spiritual realm. For some reason, I just can't get out of this time period. And tonight we're going to journey back to the year 1703, the month of June in particular, and here we find the birth of John Wesley. Samuel and Susanna Wesley, his parents, welcomed their 15th child. You heard that correctly, 15. In the town of Epworth in England. John Wesley, he was the 15th child in the family, but there was a total of 19 born to Susanna. That's a lot of kids. But this is a time period where, yes, she birthed 19, only 9 of them actually made it out of infant toddler stage. The 1700s, well, let's be honest, from about the 1300s through about mid-1800s, surviving infancy and toddlerhood was a feat for children. So the fact that we're here today says that at least some of them made it through. Samuel Wesley was a poet and the rector of Epworth. Susanna was actually from a very huge family. You thought her birthing 19 kids was impressive. She was number 25 in her family. She was the 25th child of Samuel Ainsley, a dissenting pastor. So this pastor wasn't super popular. We'll just go there. Samuel and Susanna joined the Church of England when they were very young, which what we would call today the Anglican Church. But this is not about them. This is about John, their 15th child. As was the custom for certain families of that time, all the kids were taught to read and write at a very young age. They were taught their native tongue English, old school English, Greek, and Latin, as the religious background of the parents was influenced significantly. So if you were in a family who was more religious, you didn't just learn your own language in this time period. You also had to learn the what we would call today dead language of Latin, good luck with that, and Greek, because the New Testament was primarily written in Greek. And so you had to learn both of these languages so that you could actually read the scriptures and read all the philosophers. The greatest philosophers in this time period's mind were the Greek philosophers, which actually, if we're going to look at it, was probably a wise decision on their part. In this family, the kids were expected to memorize significant portions of the New Testament, not just like a verse or two. We're talking chapters, if not entire books. They were drilled on their spiritual and gospel memory. Midday, before you could even eat lunch, you had to recite a significant portion that you'd been studying that day. And every evening, before every evening meal, this was part of the practice, that you knew your scripture, which is significantly different than how everything is today. But the family was very spiritual and very religious, and this was in their mind. You learned religion, you worked your way to heaven. There was no such thing as a free ride. If you didn't work, slave, and dedicate yourself to the dictates of the church, yeah, you and Lucifer were going to have a really good time. And that's what they instilled with fear into these children throughout this time period. And this went from the Catholic Church all the way down to the Anglican churches and all the Lutherans and the rest of them. They all had this very strong, very rigid, very militaristic view of religion, which, made people really want to go to church at the time, didn't it? In 1714, around the age of 11 years old, John was sent to the Charterhouse School in London. Kind of a typical thing for religious parents to do. This was a religious boarding school, and I've had experience with those. Not like this. The one I went to was just a high school, but it was themed towards the religion I was raised in. So the environment changed, but the actual teachings did not. And in 1720, John entered the Christ Church in Oxford. And Oxford's been around for a while. It's one of the premier universities and colleges of its day, and still one of the top-ranking ones even in our current years. After graduating, though, he decided to stay on and work on his master's degree. He loved the studies. So in 1725, John actually was ordained into the Anglican Church as a priest. And in 1726, he was elected as a fellow to the Lincoln College as an aspect of Oxford. Oxford, and I didn't realize this fully until doing some of the research here in the last few years, Oxford ate a lot of other places, and within Oxford there's a whole bunch of different little colleges, universities, schools, all branches of kind of a central hub concept. So that was pretty cool. At least that's how I understand it. If I'm wrong, let me know. So John, he wasn't stupid by any stretch. He was very intelligent, and he grasped really deep concepts in religion and spirituality pretty quickly, which is evident in his extensively adventurous life. So after he began teaching a variety of different courses within this college, but the college teaching was short-lived. He got bored. Not really. He actually felt called to minister. Just go back to the church, do the ministry thing. And so in 1727, he completed his master's degree and moved back to his hometown of Epworth. And this led to his priestly ordination, full priestly ordination, in 1728. So he was ordained as just kind of a minister, and then he was taken all the way up to priest in 1728. This was a time when you couldn't just be a pastor. You couldn't just go in and lead a service, if you were not brought into the church through a formal ordination, basically a lineage guidance system, you were no better than the common person, and you would never have been allowed to lead a service. It went against everything that these churches stood for back in this time period, which was not really the best way of looking at things because, and this is a side note, my opinion, during these time periods, the 1300s all the way up to about mid-1800s, the churches had a stranglehold on religion. Even through the Reformation periods, Martin Luther doing his 93 Theses, and the rest of them, primarily the Catholic Church still dictated most of what people did within the religious groups. And so if you did not have a direct lineage through ordination back to the mother church, you didn't fare so well. So that just puts a different spin on some things that happened later on in John's life. So the interesting part, though, is when he got his priestly ordination in 1728, it led him to the study of mysticism. Not as deeply as other people I've talked about, but it did actually bring him into a different view of life. The plot starts to form, of course. I don't just talk about random people. They have to have some kind of shift or adjustment to the spiritual and or religious world. So John took the strict view of giving alms or tithe very seriously. He literally lived his preaching. That's just what he was. His goal was to live a life where he lived the very values that he preached and believed in his heart. This was not someone who took something halfway and was like, oh, this is good enough. He went as far as he could, to the point where he would actually deprive himself of food and shelter at times so that he could keep up with his very rigorous giving and donations. Studying scriptures to chase this concept of the holiness of the mind, body, and soul, because he was taught, and this will adjust later, but he was taught that if you didn't study the scriptures, if you didn't basically flagellate yourself, if you didn't give everything that you possibly could, there's no way in anything that you're getting it to heaven. So doomed is, and doomed you shall always be unless you follow the dictates, and that's how he was taught. In 1729, John actually went back to Oxford after preaching for a while, for about 2 years it looks like, and he moved a lot during this time. Been there, done that. I totally understand this concept. In about 15 years, I moved over 30 times, so I understand where he's coming from. While he was bouncing around, he'd leave for Oxford, he'd come back, he'd leave, he'd come back. His younger brother, though, Charles, stayed at Oxford and actually started a group for spiritual study and dedicating oneself to the Christian lifestyle. My light is really bright on my eyeballs right now. So when one of the times that John returned to Oxford, he ended up taking over the group that his brother Charles had started. And it appears under his leadership, from what I was able to root around, this is where he really started to step into his own as a pastor, priest, minister, lead religious person. And as he stepped into this role, the group that Charles had started actually started to expand, and it flourished beyond what I think Charles had expected, which is just what happens. But with that growth came a huge dedication to the Christian ideal. John's belief was very strict on how he treated himself, and what I found interesting is the people that he was associating with looked to him as how they should model their lives, and that's how they all started to practice. And it spread within the group to the point where the group actually saw this is what living a Christian life truthfully meant. We have a prime example here. He's doing it. He's literally doing what everyone else is saying to do, but he's actively doing it, where they're saying it, not actually living it. Unfortunately, a pretty common thing for leaders in almost every group, if we're going to go there. Not saying that they're not preaching or teaching something good. Proof's in the pudding, and that's how I usually roll with my life, is if I can't tell by how you're acting what you're saying, I probably am not going to listen to you. That's just me. Anyway, the group that he was in, and him and John John and Charles kind of co-led, but John was taking primary, met for prayer and study about 3 hours every morning. In one of the references, it said that they would meet at 6 a.m. before breakfast, and they would study, pray, memorize, even do praise services, singing, and things like that for a full 3 hours before they would even break fast, like before they even had breakfast. This was a consistent thing for them, and it was 7 days a week, not only on Sundays or only on days that, or holy days or whatever. This was every single day for 3 hours. Just as a thought, how many people who will watch this sit for 3 hours and practice and dedicate themselves to any practice, even if it's only 1 day a week? And when you start to think about it, that really puts a spin on how dedicated he really was. The group would pray several minutes every waking hour of the day. So they would do this 3 hour intensive first thing in the morning. And then starting after they were done, let's say they got done with that, and at 10, they would pray fervently for 5 or 10 minutes at 10 o'clock. They would pray 5 or 10 minutes fervently at 11 o'clock. They would pray 5 or 10 minutes fervently at noon. This was how they went through their life, from sunup till sundown, pretty much in constant prayer and meditation. That's a lot of dedication. And the other thing that I thought was interesting is the church at the time, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, only required communion. And if you haven't had that, it's taking it, eating the blood of Christ, grape juice, and unless you're Catholic, then it's wine. And then usually an unleavened bread, the body of Christ. And a lot of churches in the Protestant religions will do that 4 times a year. The Catholics, it varies from church to church. A lot of them do it every single week. It's called taking Mass. But the Church of England only mandated it 3 times a year. It was offered pretty much weekly, but they only required you to do it 3 times a year. The group that John was involved in and led started doing it every single Sunday. They really wanted to practice what they preached. And this was what I've described so far, which sounds like a lot, was literally a drop in the bucket for what this group practiced. They were so dedicated to their belief. They had an amazing list, and it didn't matter where I was looking online. Every one of them, when they came to this part of their life before the organization really grew, their list of charitable actions and spiritual pursuits was so far beyond what, honestly, I gave them credit for originally. But the fact that it's everywhere I looked during this time for John and his group, it's impressive to me. Most people have a hard time staying with a job for 4 or 5 years that you only go to 8 hours a day. These guys were literally living a divinely guided path. Their belief was divinely guided for up to 8 and 10 hours a day, depending on how much they were awake. And sometimes some of the references said that they only slept for 4 hours. So think about it. For 20 hours a day, you're dedicating your entire existence to this ideal of, I am going to work my way to heaven. And that's what they were doing. I give them credit for the dedication. John and his group did receive quite a bit of ire and negativity that increasingly, Oxford was becoming increasingly non-religious at this time. They were valuing truth, knowledge, and reason above anything religious. They started to view religion as a superstition and mysticism. It's a downside of the educated mind is they think that reason defines logic and religion cannot live in the same world. That's not true. Just heads up. If someone says, I educated myself out of religion, no, you educated yourself into really not being open to all aspects of who you are. Being spiritual, being religious is a part of the human condition. You can argue with me about that till the cows come home, but I've seen it play out more often than not. So, anyway, this attitude against them grew when one of the group had a mental breakdown. And he ended up dying because of his mental snap. Oddly enough, this isn't that uncommon in people who put this much focus where you work your way to heaven. It tends to wear on the psyche because you're putting too much effort into something that should be more free-flowing, in all honesty. The school blamed the aggressive, ritualistic lifestyle that John had espoused as the cause of death. John denied this accusation, obviously. And it was during this time that of negativity and kind of minor persecution that an anonymous pamphlet ended up being published and circulated around Oxford. And the group was insultingly called at this time the Oxford Methodists, meaning it as a really bad slur. Like, these people, they're over here being all thinking they're religious, but their methods, and they only follow a methodological pattern. They only do things by rote. They don't think for themselves. I mean, it was it was really ignorant. But John and his group kind of decided to poke a hole in their argument. So they took the title as a Methodist as a group name. Like, fine, you want to call us that? Cool, we'll take it. And so when they would be, someone at the school would try to insult them by being like, oh, you're the Methodists. They'd be like, yes, we are. And it totally deflated the argument. Because how do you insult someone who takes it as a title and puts it as a badge of honor? Like, yes, we are. What are you going to do about it? And that's kind of how they lived. The thing with John, though, is he worked extremely hard at building the inner spiritual connection and allowing that to play out by trying to live a perfected Christian life. He would eventually sit down and start writing down a chart of his day. Way more time on his hands than I'm willing to give to something like this personally. And he would rate how he lived on this chart. It went hour by hour, and he would grade himself at each step of the day. So during this hour, I gave myself an 8. I prayed the entire hour. But I had lunch at this hour, so I'm only giving myself a 5 because I wasn't fully dedicated. I was eating. Things like that is how he would break down his day. Okay. He took anger and hatred that was directed at him as a sign that he was doing the right thing and that his group was actually on the right path. He believed the mark of a true Christian meant that you had to be hated for your devotion, that you were so devoted that it irritated other people, and instead of getting annoyed wanting to do better, they would just get angry at you. Can't really argue with that logic because there's times I do that. I poke at people until they're angry at me, and then I laugh at them when they realize why they're angry because they want to have that aspect of life, but don't know how. And that's how he viewed it, was we're doing the right thing and it's making other people uncomfortable. Okay, I can work with that. Life was interesting for John Wesley, at least in my opinion. I dug through several websites and I went through a lot of historical stuff. My phone's going off. Let me kill that real quick. Okay, sorry. And he had a really amazing life. He started off extremely devout, and by this point, he had an entire school angry at him. How do you do that? Like, you're not that old. But in 1735, John and his brother Charles made their way across the Atlantic to America, expanding their horizons, I guess. They were on a journey to Georgia, where John had sought to be the minister of a newly formed parish within Georgia. And it was on this journey that John was introduced to another group of people. And I'm going to have a little bit of a deviation through here because I had to figure out what they stood for. I didn't quite follow it. But the group that he ran into was called the Moravian, Moravian people. The group was grounded in a concept called pietism. I had to look it up. It's a legalistic devotion to Christian doctrine, and it sprung up in the mid-1600s through the 1700s, and it left the more relaxed, quote-unquote, Lutheran teachings, and these people went legalistic with how they practiced Christianity. And this was a very new belief of an even more intense personal relationship with Christian ideals that caught the focus of people like John Wesley. Pietism, though, to me, is what I would call the problem with mainstream religion, is they have this legalistic where you actually have to do the right thing. There is a law that you have to abide, and if you're not abiding by the law, they would actually kick you out. They would kick out family members. It was a very strict way of looking at life, and it didn't leave for something so simple or as basic as happiness or joy. It was your every single thought, word, and deed had to be put through the filter of, is this going to send me to hell or not? And it was a little rough. But this did kind of conflict with some of John's more mystical interests, because he did understand and he was studying people like Emanuel Swedenborg and a few of these other ones who were teaching him that there is a spiritual world out there. And this does influence him later on in life. Right now, he's just absorbing, learning, trying to understand more about what he was, how to be a good person. So John sought to learn more about this new way of devotion. This devotion served him as he served the people in America, and he tried to work with and convert the Native Americans. What I was raised calling the Indians, but we can't call them that anymore. But as it seems to be a big part of life to his point, of course, there was some controversy and things weren't so great for him after a while. This time, it was over a woman. A woman that he might have loved at one point, except for he believed during this time in his life that the concept of clerical celibacy was a must. Obviously not fully within the Anglican Church was this a true theory. This was what he had trained himself to believe. And it led him to deny her communion after she married another man. So she married somebody else because he wouldn't marry her. And he got mad about it. So when she came to receive Holy Communion, he would not allow her to participate in the blood of Christ and the body of Christ. Not the best thing to do. But, what can you say? Jealous much there, John? Anyway, this didn't go so well. And he ended up being chased out of Georgia's colony, and he fled back to England in 1737. He really liked to wear that persecution badge. Before his abrupt departure to England, he did write and publish one of his many hymnals. So if you actually look him up, he has several hymnals, songs, and etc. attributed to him. And this was the first Anglican hymnal ever published in America, which is pretty impressive. The fact that he did that in 2 years also says a lot about his dedication to his task. Beaten down, of course he would be at this point, and starting to doubt a lot of things in his life, when he returned to England and with his brother Charles, he went to find counsel with the Moravians that were there. And he ended up moving to Germany for a period of time to study with them. And it was in this area of time, after 1737 or so, that John had what he would call his Aldersgate experience. This event actually occurred when he was in one of his darkest times. He was going through what we would call in the spiritual community a dark night of the soul. Life sucked. That's a technical term. He basically was dragged to an event, and he did not want to go. Everything that I read about the lead up to this is he was pretty much looking at a way to cut off all ties with anything to do with any religion. He was very beat down at this point. And so he was, almost literally dragged to this event where he listened to the preface to the epistle to the Romans, the letter to the Romans, that Martin Luther had written. So this introduction to the letter of Romans that Martin Luther, founder of Lutheranism, actually started to inspire him. This was combined with other events that went on, and not everything was clear during this. At least I couldn't find it. There was a lot of information I was trying to put together here. So, but I couldn't find everything, but there was Martin Luther's preface to the book of Romans was a major turning point for him. And it was only a week-long experience that he had, this awakened in John this new belief, this new concept. One of the phrases I saw was, it woke up a new heart in him. I'm okay with this phrasing. This was the beginning of the new era for John Wesley. The evangelical topics that inspired him to go inside, and this led him to the belief of salvation through faith. Now this was something very controversial. The fact that God's grace was free to everybody was not popular in the time. This was a time period of you work, you slave, you give everything to the church, and maybe if you're lucky, the priest would say the right prayer and get in with the big man upstairs, but probably not. And this was the time. So for John to come up with this belief that God's grace was free and that your salvation was through the belief and faith in God, not in your works, but in this belief concept, was not popular, if you could only imagine. Many today believe that it was during this time and this transition that made John and his future church a reality. So this concept, this new idea, which really isn't that new if you've actually read the Bible. Anyway, this was what a lot of philosophers and historians say made John's new church, the Methodist Church, what we would call today the Methodist Church. If he would not have had this transition, his entire branch, the way we know it today, would never have existed, because this is what woke him up. Oddly enough, because John's history with England and in the Church of England, he couldn't preach in most churches. They didn't really like his new views, let's just put it that way. And he did read stuff and study stuff and kind of apply some of these other teachings. Emanuel Swedenborg was one of them, but there was a long list, and I mean, some of these people I'd never even heard of before, and I study mysticism. But these were the mystic people of his day that he was reading and researching, and with his more controversial and previously strict ideas, the church didn't want him anywhere near the pulpit. You stay out, you heretic. This didn't stop him from writing many hymns, compiling hymns, and publishing a lot of these hymnals, so the songs that you'd sing in church. He did, though, meet with various religious groups over these years, and he talked with lots of them. But he was not allowed to preach in many churches during this time. Maybe a few outliers that didn't really care what the mother churches were saying, and they would let him, have a pulpit for a day or two. And this was kind of the way it went for him until an old Oxford buddy of his, and Oxford buddies look out for each other, who also was pretty much banned from preaching because of his beliefs as well. Interesting how this is playing out, right? This gentleman introduced John to the concept, again, not new, but new to the time, which is the open air sermon. Kind of like the guy who formed the basis of Christianity, that Jesus character, how he preached out on hillsides and outside of the church because the churches were, corrupt. That's what it was. Real new idea here. Anyway, sorry. As I was going through this and I kept coming across this information, I was like, are you serious? This wasn't a thing? I mean, even today, the church I was raised in, we did just as much outside, especially in the summer, as we did inside. It was just kind of what we did. The fact that there was actually a period of time, and it was during this era, where you only were allowed to preach if it was in a designated, consecrated church with a pulpit and fill in the blank with it. Okay, but that's where they were at during this time. And so what John was starting to do was, again, revolutionary, basically. A little tea. Anyway, so John resisted, though. Being trained and raised and ordained in the Church of England, the Anglican Church, he felt this was not the way to save souls. What are you doing preaching outdoors? For shame. He felt that the rituals that the church held were of such importance and held such great meaning that they have to be observed in the proper environment, and they have to be performed with the proper pomp and circumstance and the proper ideas and ideologies. Like, you have to be very serious about this stuff. But over time, his friend wore him down, and he started to see the benefit in this common preaching, and where you're speaking to the common man and the common woman in their environment. Like Jesus hung out with the prostitutes and the lepers. But in this open air settings, and sometimes, and I thought this was so weird, maybe it's just because of the way I view cemeteries, he would actually hold some of his open air sermons in cemeteries. At one point, he would use his own father's gravestone as his pulpit. Okay. I thought that was an odd little twist on his life. Anyway, but he would preach to anyone who would listen. It really fired him up over time, and so he started doing this more and more. The cemeteries, town squares, fields, it didn't matter. If he could get people, he would preach. And from what I found, he would preach open air in this more relaxed style. Fields, cemeteries, town squares, random churches that would let him in. And randomly he would get actually invited to these different churches. I did find out over time some of these outside churches would start to invite him in because they heard what he was doing and how he would preach. And they were like, yeah, you want to come do that at our church? Like, come on over. And he would practice and preach like this for around 50 years. Some sources say 45, some say his entire life. Don't quite buy that. But 50 years was a good round number. But, poor John, not everything was sunshine and salvation for him. In 1739, John broke with the Moravians and developed the Methodist Society. Couldn't let go of that Oxford Methodist insult slur, but he saved it in my mind. Even though he was an ordained Anglican priest, a lot of other preachers in his society that he had been building were not ordained. They were just people who'd studied the Bible with him and were now teaching. And this, again, controversial for the time, but it didn't stop John. He was like, full steam ahead, let's do this. He threw churches rules about who could preach and under what authority that they were allowed to preach. He took their little book and folded it up and right out the window. I have to say, I really thought that was impressive, and as I was going down that rabbit hole, for someone who is trained and ordained as a pastor, minister, and priest within the Church of England, it's almost like he learned the rules so that he could bend them and show them where they were wrong. He never let go, and this is the one thing that I thought was interesting. He never let go of his training, but he also thought that some of it was not appropriate. And so everything in his world was a balancing act, and he performed it very well. Obviously. Of course, letting, a lay person preach, the church hated him for that. And his Methodist society continued to be hated, and it grew with the hatred because now you have these random, unwashed folks, the non-ordained, preaching, scandalize the church. I mean, they have vapors and needing their smelling salts and all that stuff. Anyway, the crazy part was, as much as they hated him for a reason that even today, it baffled me that they hated him because he was letting people preach the Bible outside. He wasn't even bringing them into their churches and shoving this person in front of the pulpit. They were out in the field. They were out in the cemetery. And the church was just having issues with this. I mean, like the Church of England. The church claimed that he was fomenting dissent from the church. They believed that he was stealing, flock stealing is what they call it when I was growing up. His society worked with the poor people, the downtrodden, the literally unwashed masses in some cases. People that the Church of England and a lot of these outlying churches would have never let these people walk in the door. Kind of like that other time. Anyway, they claimed that John Wesley was building a fanatical group that was blindly following their cult leader. Okay. The church would do this because they felt threatened. They were making stuff up. None of this was true. The historical records outside of the church have no backing for what they were saying. They were literally trying to fear people out of John's teachings. They claimed that John and his group were performing miracles, leading people into the darkest parts of the world. And then they claimed, you gotta love these people, the church claimed that John Wesley and his followers would physically attack the clergy, the bishops, the priests, etc., of the Anglican Church, and also of any other organized church. They were spreading this rumor, blatant lie, that these priests and bishops were getting beat up when they would leave the church to go out to go get groceries or whatever, because these guys didn't agree with them. When you read through and study even a minute amount of John's work, violence was never an answer for him. I personally thought this guy was great because he stood up to these bullies like you would. Like, they're over there being loud and noisy and you just keep doing your thing. John stood up to all of this. Their slander, their lies, blatant defamation, good flaming word now. He felt, in a lot of ways, that the church of his time had been corrupted. The Church of England didn't call the sinner to repent. It wallowed in greed. It wallowed in power. It wallowed in control. Like I said, kind of liking this guy. John felt a divine calling to bring about a revival to Christianity to save it from itself, even to the point where he had to shatter his strict old beliefs that were ingrained from childhood. And anyone who's ever had to go through a period of time where they had to peel back their birth religion, peel back those ingrained teachings, and shatter that old self and rebuild. If you've ever done that on a small scale, imagine doing that to something that had been part of your life for 40 years, where your entire world centered on this one aspect. But to grow, you literally have to throw it all away. Shatter it, break it down, rearrange the parts, throw a whole pile of it out the window, and start over. This is what happened when he had his Aldergate experience. It shattered everything that he knew from being taught, ordained, his education, and he had to start, in one sense, all over. That's not an easy task when you're young, let alone when you're in your 40s. And this all happened in this time period. One of the tenets that John had to break within his own mind, and this is huge, is the need for formal ordination to preach and to teach. Through a significant portion of prayer and study and simple divine guidance, he started what we would call today the practice of lay pastors. You didn't have to go to seminary to be able to preach up front. And pastors or preachers, depending on what denomination you're with. And through this practice, Methodism, the Methodist religion, grew from a society into an actual, full-fledged, functioning religion. And of course, as with everything in life, there are growing pains. So John acquired various chapels and buildings that he would use, like old dilapidated chapels. He'd buy them for pennies, basically. And they would rebuild them, fix them up, make them look nice. Sometimes he'd just buy a random building that was sitting in town, not doing anything, and they would convert it to a chapel. While he was doing all of this, he was also training pastors to be able to preach. And over the years, for the last, from about the time he was 40 to basically till the time he died, he had developed a various set of rules and regulations, just kind of a way to keep people towing the spiritual line, so to speak. Over the years, though, he refined them, and these became the tenets, the basis for the modern-day Methodist Church. And over time, when they started to really develop into a society, they needed a little bit of a hierarchy, just kind of as much as I'm just from reading about him and studying him for the last little while, this is not something I think he wanted it to happen, but they needed a basic governing body just so that the rules and the adjustments would stay the same. And so he eventually became the president of the First Methodist Conference, like the general conference for the Methodist Church. Another thing, there's a lot of things that I found with this guy that, looking at it from today's viewpoint, didn't make a lot of sense to me. But looking at it from the idea that he was trying to build as a church, I could see where he was going with it. And this was another one of those odd things. John set up a rotating schedule of the pastor or preacher, and he believed that they did their best when they moved every year or two. They were the most efficient when they could spread their unique way of teaching to new faces. And like I said, it took me a little bit going through this because this is such an odd concept, even though I've had a bazillion pastors in my life over the years because of moving in and out and me moving around. So I can see where he was going, because most people, and you have to admit it out loud, that's fine, you don't have to admit that, but admit it in your own mind. If you listen to the same pastor, preacher, priest for more than 2 or 3 years, what starts to happen? You start to get bored with hearing, it doesn't matter what the sermon is, it's the same old sermon. Because you figured out the person's way of speaking, their mannerisms, the way they present themselves, and unless they're preaching something completely out of the blue, you've heard the sermon before. So like I said, I can see where rotating these preachers around every couple of years would keep you interested, keep you listening, like, ooh, what's this guy going to say? He has a different way of standing up there. Some people are more active in talking with their hands. I'm getting horrible about that. Other people would stand there very calmly and they would just read through the scriptures, but they all had a unique perspective. And this was his way of saying, these perspectives, the more we spread them around, the more people hear, the better this is going to be for the overall church. Smart man. Side note, just as something to think about. And like I mentioned this a little bit beforehand, but I want to reinforce this. John did his own thing. He did it his own way. But he never forgot where he came from. Even shattering his beliefs and his entire way of practicing life, he never did renounce his connection to the Anglican Church. He would go so far to make concessions to the old church that didn't violate his conscience so that they could live in peace. He didn't want to fight with the Anglican Church. He would do things purposely to stay out of their way. He wasn't stopping what he was doing. He respected where they were at, but he was not going to comply with them anymore, but he didn't want to openly fight with them either, which, like I said, was pretty cool. That being said, no matter how much they pressured him to stop letting his lay preachers go out there and talk, that wasn't happening. And he taught his beliefs in the salvation by faith. And he told them time and again, because they tried constantly to get him to dissolve the Methodist Church and basically incorporate what you got going on back into the Church of England. And he's like, no, this is mine, that's yours, I'm over here, stay in your lane, basically. Anyway, John would eventually relax some of his more strict beliefs and would start to ordain through the laying on of hands. And he did this with one person in particular, but it ended up being several more over the years. The first one, he detested the term bishop. He felt that was tied to the Anglican Church and it should stay there. So he preferred the term, as a leader of a group of churches, superintendent. So through the laying on of hands, he ordained a superintendent to the Methodist Church within the United States after the Civil War. Like, the amount of history that this man saw, what we would call history during his life, was like, are you kidding me? That's impressive. Because after the Civil War occurred, the Church of England was completely disestablished, kicked out, removed, broke down in the southern states where it had its strongest foothold. So his way of helping basically support his own church and the people who were in the southern United States at the time rebuild, kind of save their lives, type of like their livelihoods, he ordained through his laying on of hands the superintendent Thomas Coke, not Cook. I'm thinking something else. Thomas Coke. And to help Thomas Coke within his work within the United States, southern United States, John ordained Richard, this is such a weird name, Whatcoat? It's literally spelled Whatcoat, Whatcoat. I might be saying that completely wrong. And he also ordained Thomas Vassie as priests. So Richard Whatcoat and Thomas Vassie were two priests that he sent with Thomas Coke, a lot of Thomases, who Thomas Coke was a superintendent to help support and spread the word of the Methodist Church in the southern United States. Interestingly enough, John actually instructed Thomas Coke to ordain Francis, I'm going to screw this up, I think, Asbury as a superintendent as well. So we had Coke was the head superintendent, Asbury was his second in command, basically. And they had these two newly ordained priests. The two superintendents, when they got to the States, were to ordain new priests as the need arose to help the American Methodist Episcopal Church. So we'll get into that. But again, poor John. He couldn't have things go smoothly at all. In 1787, Coke and Asbury decided they didn't like the term superintendent, and they started to demand that the Methodist American Episcopal Church call them bishops. No more superintendents. We want authority. And this really did upset John. In several of his letters that I was going over and some of the writings about him, he fought with them in a polite way, but it was definitely like, you guys, this is not what I want. This is not what your titles are. Stop it. And they pretty much ignored him. What was interesting is during John's newfound ordination practices, his brother Charles was very not impressed, which I thought was weird. But he thought that what John was doing is going to just infuriate the Church of England. And so Charles was like, stop. We need to make peace with the Church of England. All you're doing is making a bigger fight. Stop, please stop. But John was pretty much like, they don't tell me what to do. They stay in their lane, I stay in mine. This is my lane. So he kept going. He believed in the saving of souls trumped the hurt feelings of the Church of England. Justified, I guess. He felt that a person's salvation is a personal thing. This is not something that the church can hand you. If you don't have it, in his mind, it didn't exist, so you have to figure this out. And something that no intercessor could hand out. No priest is going to be the one that grants you your salvation through penance or, go hit yourself with a whip so many times. That's not helping. Your salvation is your business, and that was his view. He believed that it was the connection to God and the movement of spirit within a person's life, and that showed truth. That proved salvation, and it wasn't a one and done. You had to keep working at it, but it was work through faith, so it's not like physical labor. It was praying and communing with the divine, that type of a practice, which is getting more into that more mystic influences that he researched and studied. The personal connection during this time period was classified in a lot of people's minds as non-Christian. It was a pagan thing. It was heretical, basically. But it also lined up with Christian mysticism, which was you commune directly with God, not through another person, which kind of is biblical. Anyway, another thing that swayed away from the cultural norms of the time was John's encouragement of women to have active roles within his church. Because if you haven't looked at the Church of England and the Church of Lutheranism, the Lutheran Church, and you looked at the history of the Catholic Church, women were there to clean. Keep your mouth shut, your head down, and clean. You were here to serve men. Nuns were to take care of orphans, but they stayed in their little cloister, don't come out. Even supporting women as preachers, within certain guidelines to the beginning, but over time, John had some really good arguments brought to his attention for the cause of allowing women to be pastors and preachers. And he eventually did fully support, and through his line, ordain women into the role of preaching. They still had to wear their head coverings, which was expected by all women in any church during this time period. And all I could find was this was a holdout from an extremely old tradition going back another several hundred years. It's not like one Middle Eastern religion who will execute you if you don't. This was more of just a way of showing respect because, and I can't remember where it says in the Bible, I meant to write it down. In the biblical belief, a woman's hair is her glory, so by covering her glory, she's submitting to the rule of God in the church. So there's a respect thing to it. I just can't remember how far back it goes. John, throughout his life, lived what he preached. He advocated for a vegetarian diet, and over time, which this was huge considering the church he came out of, he cut all alcohol out of his diet. Caveat. During this time, when he cut all alcohol out of his diet, this was specifically pointing to wine and hard liquor, spirits. Because you didn't drink water unless you were dirt poor, and that's why your life was only like 35 years. Because the water was poisonous, basically. At the time, they didn't have water purification at all. And so most people, your everyday beverage was a low alcohol beer. Kind of like if you're drinking Busch Light. And so that's what they would drink. And they didn't call it alcohol. That was a beverage. And so you would drink that. That was still acceptable. But as far as like harder liquors, I believe one of the references I saw, they actually had a form of whiskey at the time, and any form of wine, he just cut it completely out of his diet, because in his eyes, you could not live a truly Christian life if you were drinking that. And going to a vegetarian diet in his mind was cutting out the flesh from basically cutting out a murder from your system, so you weren't killing something to live. Which doesn't make a lot of sense, because you're killing the plant to eat it to live. Pick your battles. Fun fact, thanks to these beliefs that he espoused and built into the Methodist Church, they kind of became some of the leadership in the temperance movements in the early 1900s, Prohibition. They were kind of not the full leadership, but they were in the higher up of pushing that agenda. You win some, you lose some. A man that was full of life and vigor through his entire life did eventually get married, though, when he was about 48, so he waited a minute. But this did not last long. His wife was a widow, and she had 4 children. They were raised already. But they had an on-again, off-again relationship where, yes, they got married, and they would live together, and then she would leave, and then she'd come back, and then she'd leave, and then she'd come back. And her argument when they finally did officially split, and I couldn't find if it was a true divorce or if it was just a separation, because you didn't divorce in that time. But her argument was she could never compete with his true love, preaching the gospel, and his very, very, very strong devotion to God. Basically, she felt like she was the side chick, using today's terms. So they did eventually separate, but he lived a very full and active life up until about the last year or so of his time on Earth. And as I was going over his end of life, there was a lot of interesting quotes, and I didn't write any of them down. I'm still trying to figure out the copyright thing here. But to me, it felt like, personal opinion, God was giving him a period of time to wind down. Get your last of your messages said, teach who you can teach, because in the last year or so of his life, his eyesight finally started to go, and it didn't just slip a little bit. He went from being able to see, from what I read, really clearly, to being almost blind by the end of his life. And it was this last year where everything declined. Arthritis hit him extremely hard. There were some internal issues. Medical journals at the time were questionable at best, so they didn't go into a lot of details, but it sounded kind of like his body, his internal organs just kind of like shut down. And this did eventually lead to his death in 1791. He actually lived an exceptionally long life for this time period, because he was 87 when he died, in a time when the average lifespan was like 42. Might have been 50, you can correct me on that, I'm okay with that. But it wasn't very long of a lifespan, because the health practices were, like I said, questionable. John, over his life, wrote very profusely. He preached to crowds in the ways that he felt God led him to preach, being well read for his time. Some of the stuff he chose to read was frowned upon by good Christian folk, his mystic readings. He delved into the concept of Christian mysticism, and it did influence him. And I personally feel, from what I was reading, as I said, I didn't read a lot of his writings. I read the stuff that about him and quotes of his time. And it did influence how he viewed the world, the Christian mystic traditions and authors of the time. And I have to say this because I'm going to be honest with you guys. I'm a little remiss, and I don't want to say this, but I didn't read a significant portion of his own writings, so pointing to specifics is not something I can do, unfortunately. But I do know that his concept of a personal connection to the divine, that we do not need an intercessor or a priest to go to God for us, these were biblical in a lot of ways because that's what Jesus taught when he was on earth. But for this time period, those were classified as mystic ideas. Christian mystic because you're still going through Jesus to God, but that's how they were applied. John Wesley's reach was and is vast. There are currently over 70 million people worldwide that are associated with the Methodist Church or many of the various offshoots. The Episcopal Church is an offshoot. The Pentecostals actually have ties loosely, distantly to the Methodist Church. His practices and his beliefs sprouted many churches, and a lot of denominations can be tied back to his practices, his beliefs, and his philosophies. And it's amazing how when you go through some of these people's lives, Christian mystics, even the occultists, there's usually a period in time when they have a divine revelation, and it changes everything. These people will go from being a nobody. No one would ever hear of some of these people. They have that one event that occurs, and it shifts their entire life, and it changes history. They don't realize it. They just think it's an event. We can look back now and say that one event literally reshaped the history of this person. It changed the world for its time. And that was something that John Wesley had with his Aldersgate experience. It changed the course of his life and altered the course of Christianity for the time and allowed for the expansion of the biblical beliefs. It's just how it works. This was a really long video, but there was a lot of information. I left a lot of it out because there was so much between people who are, writing against him, his own writings, etc. There was just a lot of information out there. So John Wesley was an interesting looking cat. This is obviously a painting. They didn't have pictures back in the 1700s. That would have been cool. But this was obviously painted towards the end of his life because of the aging that occurred there. But he had a very, very harsh life. It was not always nice. His devotion is something that I think anybody, I don't care what religion, spiritual path you're on, could learn something from. It didn't matter what other people said to him. It didn't matter what they called him. Matter of fact, he embraced it to the point where he named his religious movement after it. He still stuck to his beliefs, but he wasn't so stuck that he couldn't grow. And if there's anything that I can bring forward that you take away from this is know where you are, understand where you've come from, but be okay and be open to the period of growth that can give you that next step. Who knows, someone watching one of these videos might be the next John Wesley. They might start their own new religion. So, I'm interested to hear any of your guys' thoughts who watch these. What did you think of him? I mean, obviously I've added some of my own opinions through the thing, so you can even write your opinions of what I thought. This was an exceptionally short video. I mean, it's a long video for me, but it's short for a man whose life spanned over 8 decades. And he lived his devotion across 2 continents in multiple countries, spanned an ocean, and he built a denomination that actually birthed many more after him. So what do you think of that? Let me know in the comment section below. Any criticisms, critiques, all of the above. My only request is that we be respectful, because I think we all can use some respect, and we're looking at a historical figure who did a lot to change modern day Christianity. So something to think about when you're talking about it. Now, I'll be the first one to admit I'm not always the nicest to organized religions, but there are people within those groups that do earn my respect personally. My respect doesn't mean much to a lot of people, but because of how they lived their lives. John Wesley was devoted to his life. He was devoted to God in his path. And he lived that life without question, without flaw. That's impressive to me. So, with that being said, leave a like on the video if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you like seeing this type of content. I usually go live about once a week, and sometimes twice. I like to drop videos when I'm not doing live streams. It's usually Monday, Tuesday. Like I said, leave comments. There's a link to my website in the description if you're interested in what else I do. And I will talk to you guys in a future video. And if you have any suggestions for other important, unknown, maybe known spiritual leaders, occultists, I really don't care if they're, as long as they're along those lines. I'm not going to do political figures by any stretch, but I do like to talk about and research, because I learn so much by researching these people, and I've been researching people like this for years. This is part of my own spiritual journey. So let me know in the comments section below, or you can message me on my website. That works too. I will talk to you guys later, and have an awesome rest of your week.